Hi, everyone. Welcome to this workshop hosted by Grow It From Home and in benefit of Growing Gardens Portland, which is just an amazing gardening education group that does everything really farm to table to employment around access to food, food security, and education. We just are so lucky to be working with them, and this workshop benefits their organization. So thanks everyone for coming to the workshop. And before we get started on slides, just want to remind everyone to use the chat feature. And I wanted to talk a little bit about 3 of the resources that I think everyone should have if they're going to be growing cannabis at home or they're curious about growing cannabis at home. The first is this book. It says The Beginner's Guide to Growing Vegetables. So it doesn't say cannabis on it. It is by Laureen Edwards Faulkner, who is an amazing author and photographer and woman and artist. And this gardening book is just the nuts and bolts basics on how to garden. And I always start with this book because cannabis is a plant, just like tomatoes or lettuce or peppers in your garden. So honestly, by having the foundations of how to grow great vegetables in your backyard, you already know 95% of what you need to know in order to grow cannabis successfully. It's really just another plant in your garden. So I can't emphasize that enough to everyone, and don't hesitate to ask me questions about these plants because I know they're new and they don't always feel like just another plant in our garden because they're recently legalized and many people have never grown them before. So it feels new and different, but really it's just like growing another vegetable in your garden. And that's why I highly recommend that everyone get this book and just familiarize themselves with the tools and the tips and the tricks in here to be a great vegetable gardener. Because once you do that, growing cannabis is just another vegetable in the garden. You already know 95% of what you need to know. So I highly recommend this book. For cannabis specific things, I recommend 2 other resources in book form. The first one is The Cannabis Gardener by Penny Barthel, who was actually at my farm yesterday. She's visiting, so you can check her Instagram for some fun photos from her trip yesterday. And this book is just practical, and it gives you that extra in-depth knowledge on the specifics of cannabis that are maybe a little different than tomatoes or different than corn or squash. So it's kind of like the cannabis specific gardening book, just like you might have a tomato specific gardening book. It's the same. It's very practical. Penny is an amazing author, chef, gardener. So she really comes at it from that whole perspective. And it starts with everything from soil preparation to how to preserve and enjoy your harvest as edibles and smokables in ways that are really fun and easy and delicious, just like you make a tomato salad. So I highly recommend this book, The Cannabis Gardener by Penny Barthel. And then if you want a slightly different perspective that is still very, very practical, but it includes more stories. It's more like a cookbook in that sense, where you get the recipes, but you also get the stories behind the recipes. I would recommend this book, Growing Weed in the Garden by Joanna Silver. So it's another fantastic practical gardening book. Both of these women are first and foremost gardeners and cooks who love plants and happen to also be specialists in cannabis. So again, it's like any other plant in your garden. So this book has the same in-depth level of wonderful practical information on the specifics of cannabis, but it also includes more like beautiful stories about the how-to of growing cannabis that kind of link the growing with the experience. So I recommend both books. They're amazing. And the photography is gorgeous. So I'm going to be drawing a lot on these 3 books for the workshop today. And I really recommend that you invest in at least, one of these books, definitely the vegetable book and then one of the cannabis books. So with that, before I go into my slides, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to use the chat window and I can get your questions before I switch over to my slides. No questions? Let's just see here. Any questions? I just want to make sure the window is working on this recording just because it's a new thing for me. I will say, while everyone figures out whether they're going to chat later, I will, as part of it, I am going to be cutting and trimming this beautiful branch with you guys. So the first part is going to be going through my slides and showing you lots of photos and how-to information. And I will be then going away from the slides to go back to my video presentation on that plant. Okay, so if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and start the slide presentation. Great, thanks for your comment, Gabby. And now I know the chat is still working, that we're recording. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which I can do here. Allow. Okay. Okay, this is my first time using the Wix platform with y'all, so. Just want to make sure you guys can see this. Awesome. Okay, thanks for that feedback, Andy. So I'm just going to go ahead and click present. Great. Let's see here. Okay, can you guys still see all the slides? Understood. Okay, so that doesn't work. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. Tiny, we don't want tiny, do we? Okay. Let's do this. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for the feedback. And Andy, I think you're correct, and that's my problem. So I will just go in between the chat, in between slides, and check in with everybody. So please feel free to ask your questions in real time, and I'll pause at the end of each slide. How about that? So we're just going to go for it. Okay. So hey, everyone. So this is our workshop. And I've already introduced what we do a little bit at Grow From Home, but our purpose is really to empower others to garden. And this is where we are on a mission to provide access and education around growing hemp at home, to become a trusted and legitimate source for information about the cultivation and use of CBD hemp. And then our third goal is really to build an active community of gardeners and connect that community to fun projects. That's what I'm all about. So with experts and lifestyle brands, so you really get access to this whole other layer of professionals. You're not just getting a plant or seeds or a workshop, you're getting access to people who are professionals and experts in the areas of making different things or gardening involving cannabis. So this is really important to all of us at Grow From Home. So I'm going to skip the background slide, but just briefly, Grow From Home is part of Infinite Tree, which is a USDA organic certified production farm in Southern Oregon that's nationally known for researching and developing best-in-class hemp. So you get all of the same amazing commercial infrastructure and knowledge and great plants like Victory that come out of our commercial work for farmers to be able to use in your backyard. So you're really getting the best of the best that's available nationally for your backyard, which I think I just love. And then for me personally, I'm the CEO of Infinite Tree and the head gardener at Grow It From Home. And I've got over a decade of experience building public parks and leading community groups around gardening in the city and county of San Francisco. So I've always been deeply passionate about gardening and access to public spaces and open space and food security. And for me, it's just really, I feel so lucky that I get to apply my commercial work with Infinite Tree to backyard gardeners. I get to bring you this great stuff and still be able to teach, workshops and be a gardener, which is what I've always been with y'all. So thanks for having me today to talk to you guys about harvesting and preserving your hemp crop. So today's workshop, we're going to give you a practical guide to harvesting. We're going to compare some different drying methods and also talk about how it's very easy to preserve your harvest. So before I launch into the first slide with everyone, any questions? Nope, looks good. Full screen presents, perfect. So I'm going to go back. So what is cannabis? You guys have probably noticed I've been saying the word cannabis a lot. Cannabis is the actual genus name, so the big botanical name for these plants. And cannabis includes the legal definition of two different plants. One is, it's not a different plant, it's just legally called something else if it has THC, and that makes it marijuana legally in this country, but it's still cannabis. So just like you wouldn't call a red tomato not a tomato versus a yellow tomato, just one's yellow and one's red. It just so happens in cannabis, there's the legal distinction right now where marijuana, which is cannabis botanically, has THC, so it's called marijuana legally and treated differently. And then hemp, which is the same plant, cannabis, exact same plant, but it has CBD only, so that's legally classified as hemp. So I have my little graphic here, my watercolor with CBD and THC high-fiving because they're the exact same plant, they're friends, they just happen to have different chemicals, and our country chooses to regulate them differently. So if you look at that beautiful photo with those cosmos and that cannabis plant with the trellis in the slide, you can't tell from looking at that beautiful photo in a backyard in Portland, it's a cannabis plant, yeah, but is it legally classified as marijuana or legally classified as hemp? You can't tell. They're the exact same plant structurally, like I said, botanically. They just have a little different chemical in them. So it's like red tomato versus yellow tomato. They're still tomato plants. They still require the same care and feeding. You treat them all the same. So I'm going to try really hard to use the word cannabis throughout this talk. So remember that everything that I say, if I slip and say hemp or I say marijuana instead of cannabis, it all applies botanically as gardeners. You do all the same things. So whether we call it cannabis or we call it marijuana or we call it hemp, you can do all the same things from a gardening perspective. And I really want to emphasize that for everyone. So any information you see regarding hemp or marijuana or cannabis, it should be all the same gardening wise. Not legally, but gardening wise, it's the same. Check in with everybody. Any questions there? No? Okay, remember to come hot and fast with your questions, everybody. And I love questions. Okay, so what is harvesting cannabis like? It's like harvesting any other fruit or vegetable in your garden. You have to wait and watch and check the weather and then harvest, just like you would for your corn or your tomatoes or your bell peppers. And you use the exact same cues most of the time as you would for your tomatoes and your bell peppers and your corn. Things like size, color, aroma, firmness. Nothing magical there, right? We all give our tomatoes a little squeeze and smell them and maybe cut one open and try it and see what it's like before we decide to harvest a lot of produce for the day. Exactly the same for cannabis. There are only two cues that I'll go into today that are specific for cannabis, just like there's some specifics about harvesting other vegetables. They have a sparkle and a stickiness that is a cue for you in your garden. And they also have stigma color. So we'll talk about what stigmas are as a botanical part of a plant. All plants basically have stigmas. Most plants in your garden, I should say. And the stigma color and the sparkle and sticky are kind of like cannabis specific things. But honestly, size, color, aroma, firmness, just like you pick a melon, a tomato, a piece of corn, your spinach, you got to look for all of these things just like you would for other vegetables. So that's why I really emphasize it's like harvesting any other fruit or vegetable in your garden. So if you're not like overly concerned about how you harvest your tomatoes, please don't be overly concerned about how you harvest your cannabis. I know there's a lot of information on the internet about all these like special measurements and techniques and like this lore around growing cannabis. And to be completely honest, you have to remember, I'm a commercial grower as well. I work with farms all across the country doing all sorts of really fancy commercial grow setups for, to make money as farmers. And I can tell you that I'm really not sharing with you anything different than what's in practice at a lot of farms. And just like there isn't like a wrong way necessarily for you to harvest your cannabis at home. So a lot of the information you read on the internet is really a lot of lore and anecdotal stuff and things that some backyard gardeners or indoor growers and even commercial folks believe to be true. That's not necessarily true or optimal for your harvest. So don't get caught up in all those crazy measurements. Really treat it like another vegetable in your garden. Size, color, aroma, firmness. And then cannabis lets you check it for maturity by having a sparkle and a stickiness, and then stigma color, which we'll go into. So it's really not like anything else. Don't be so concerned about when you harvest. So the cues given by your plants, I'll just review the ones that tomatoes give us so we can compare that to the ones that cannabis gives us. So reminder for everyone, tomatoes, San Marzanos are not early girls, right? They have a different shape, different color, different maturity, different use even in cooking a little bit. So I'm going to talk about early girls. It's underlined in bold. So just like your San Marzanos don't quite look like early girls, your cannabis, depending on what cultivar you're growing, might look different. You might have 3 different cultivars in your garden. Like Andy, I believe you probably have a couple different East Fork cultivars. They smell different. They look a little different, just like a San Marzano smells and looks and tastes a little different than an early girl. So you just have to kind of pay attention to the same cues, but they're going to tell you a little different things depending on the cultivar, just like your tomatoes. So an early girl tomato is going to have a shape like a tennis ball, 4 to 8 ounces. The color is going to be consistent, bright red all over when you look at the fruit. The aroma is going to have some fragrance hole, but we all kind of know it's not until you really bite into that tomato you get that full fragrant overload of whether it's ripe or not. And then firmness, it'll have a slight squeeze when ready. Whereas, some folks harvest other types of tomatoes like San Marzanos when they're quite firm because they're processed into paste. Whereas early girls, that cultivar is best harvested when the firmness has a slight squeeze when ready. So just like walking through these characteristics for tomatoes, we're going to walk through them with cannabis. And at the end of this cannabis slide, I'll stop and ask for questions. So cannabis, Blue Dream is not Victory. So everyone who's growing with Grow It From Home from us this year is for the most part growing Victory or some specialty varieties that was part of our partnership with East Fork Cultivar. And Blue Dream, just really common dispensary strain, that's why I mentioned it, is not Victory. Our Victory plants are going to be chunkier. They're going to mature earlier. They're going to have a different aroma profile. So even though they're both cannabis, they do have different size, color, aroma at harvest. So it's good to know your plants. And everything I'm going to talk about today is it's not specific to Victory, but it's keeping Victory as a cultivar in mind. But it really goes for all these techniques I'm going to talk about, go for whether it's Blue Dream or Victory. I'm just trying to emphasize that get to know your cannabis. Some are going to have different smells and different colors and different sizes, and that will help guide your journey. So Victory, the colas are typically going to be 3 to 7 inches wide, dominant cola. So that's the thickness, and with a 3 to 5 inch wide secondary cola. And I'll talk about what the dominant versus secondary is a little bit later. The color is going to be deep green with white or slightly yellow green stigmas, which we'll talk about. and they can go purple with cold night temps. That's pretty fun. They'll have a strong, like, luscious, intense, sweet floral and citrus aroma. And they'll have a slight squeeze when ready. So they're not going to be crazy firm like golf balls, but they're going to have a firmness to them when you give them a squish. So with that, checking in. So Judy has a question. Noe, glad to hear your victory is kicking butt at your home. You should share some more photos. So Judy asked, is there a cannabis reference for what the different cultivars look like and which are ripe for harvest? No, Judy, that would be such a fun flower book to put together one day. But basically, they're all very similar at harvest. I'm just going to say similar in the sense of the stigmas, like that half are going to be white, half are going to be brown, which I'm talking about. But color and aroma and size are going to be different depending on the cultivar. Just like a dahlia, like dahlias come in all sorts of different colors and sizes. Same with cannabis, but they're also dahlias. And you still harvest dahlia flowers the same way, regardless of whether it's a ball type dahlia or a, dinner plate, open flowy dahlia. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer, Judy, to you, but I will say that you really can't go wrong. And we're going to start looking at some photos and go into more specifics in this workshop right now that will help you feel like it's not like, when you harvest your tomatoes, there is general ripeness. You assess your plants based on size, firmness, color, flavor, and you go, it's time to harvest. And maybe some of the tomatoes are more ripe than other tomatoes, but you don't think too much about that when you harvest your tomatoes, right? You just go and you pull everything that looks pretty good. It's honestly the same with cannabis. If you have a variety that meets your sort of assessment for size, aroma, color, firmness, sticky, and sticky sparkle and stigma color, pull it. It's not a big deal. So it's just like what you don't like individually harvest these tomatoes and like study them with a ruler. You just say, hey, it's time to harvest, and you harvest your tomatoes. Cannabis is actually the same. So don't worry too much about differences between looking ripe for each like cultivar or like different colas on your plant. We'll get into some specifics, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. That's a great question, Judy. Okay, back to the slides. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about what this means. So the specific cannabis cues that tomatoes do not give you are the sparkle and the sticky, because cannabis has special structures called trichomes that are basically these like factories that produce resin that are part of these like cellular factories that produce all sorts of resin, and that resin is what contains a lot of the cannabinoids and other things. And when they mature, they actually sparkle as the light hits your plant, so they look frosty, and the resin's very sticky. So you can see on this photo, if you guys I don't know if you can zoom in a little bit, but you can see it looks frosted, almost like you went with a, you were doing a pastry and you had a little powdered sugar that you were tapping onto your plants, giving it a little powdered sugar dusting. That is the sparkle of the trichomes, that frostiness, that resin being produced. So when you touch your flowers as they get closer to maturity, you'll notice they're sticky. So, and this goes back to Judy's question, not all varieties of cultivars of cannabis are crazy sticky. Some are going to look intensely sticky and frosted. Some are going to be not as sticky and frosted. And that's totally okay. There really isn't like a specific day or whatever that you have to harvest to like optimize for stickiness and resin and frostiness. It's really okay. Just look at your plants when they start to get sticky and you see that it's covering, a majority of the cola. So these flower sites that you see that are like the chunky flower parts of your plant, which we'll show some more photos in a moment. That's when you know, okay, she's getting close. It's like when your tomatoes start to turn red, you're like, okay, getting close. So when they start to get frosted all over and sticky, you're like, okay, I think we're getting close. Then you want to start looking at and frostiness develops over time. So like 1 week, it might start getting frosty, but then the second week, you're like, whoa, this is like so much frostier than last week. It's like covered now. Instead of 50% frost, it's like 100% frost. And that's how you know it's maturing and it's getting close. The other thing is stigma color. So you'll see these little green hairs that are on the plant here in the photo, like kind of like greeny yellow, little curly hairs that are coming off the plant, especially if you start at the top of the plant, a little triangle at the top, you'll see them, and they're getting like kind of a brown curl on the edges. That's a sign that they're maturing. When they start darkening and turning amber, and that whole structure, instead of being just brown amber at the tip, the whole thing will go brown amber. That's how you know it's time. That's really the cue. When you start getting those darkening of those stigmas, that's when you know this plant is ready. It's all cultivars. It's universal to cannabis. You really can't go wrong. When they start darkening, it's done. So I'm going to go back to questions. I bet you guys have any questions there. So Andy asks, I'll get to your define stigmas. Stigma is a botanical part of the plant. I am actually totally blanking on how to describe this. I'm going to just, I don't want to speak incorrect, share with the group the botanical definition of a stigma in 1 second. Let's see here. Right. So stigma is the part of the flower that gets pollen from pollinators, such as bees, but cannabis doesn't get pollinated by bees like that. So it's a female reproductive part of the flower that comes out of the pistil. So the stigma is on the top of the style. So I'm gonna I will see if I can share. I'm sharing my screen with you guys, so I think you should be able to see this. It comes out of the pistil. So if you guys can see this, like this structure, so like this is the pistil, and this is actually a plant that has pollen and a stigma. But cannabis, like this is basically the stigma that comes out. And that's a terrible example for cannabis. I mean, plant reproductive structure is bonkers. I'm just going to say that. And that's why I don't want to misspeak, because it can be very specific. But the stigma is like that part that comes out of the cannabis plant. That's like a little colored kind of like little finger coming off of the flower parts for cannabis. We will talk about mold in a moment, Gabby. So Andy's question again about harvest. Okay, so we're talking about mold. Okay. Yeah, I'll point it out in the plant. Actually, that's a good point. Reproductive stigma. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so actually, this example, it's going to be really hard because we're not zoomed in. But if you guys want to take a look, maybe I'll use my prop here. So if you guys can see this. So these little white hairs. Let's see, can you see these? See these white hairs, like right here? Things, they look like, things in the breeze, like they would trap pollen if they needed to. That is a stigma, and they're coming out of I think of it as a calyx, but it's the pistil. It's part of the calyx, I think is how it goes botanically. I know I'm forgetting my botany here on this with plant structures. I should know it better. The books that I mentioned earlier go into great detail on this. So check the diagrams in the book, but basically check those out. And when they start to go from white, or they could be yellowy green or white to amber, basically whatever color it starts out with shouldn't be amber. And when they start to go browny, amber, dark colored, and half of them are that way, like half per, like if you look at a couple nugs and half of them are brown and the other half aren't, now you know it's time. Okay, so let's talk about mold. Yeah, so Noe looks close, but for a first-time gardener, not sure. To be honest, it's your first time gardening anything. You're like, are my sweet potatoes ready? Is my corn ready? How do I know? And I think you just have to observe every week and then follow those guidelines we talked about. So let's go back. Okay, so actually I'll just talk about this real quick in person since we have it. So basically the issue with harvesting is that, like anything, like let's say you get a really big rain and you still have cantaloupe out in the field, you're like, do I harvest my cantaloupe a little early? That's okay. If you're going to have rain for a couple days and then it's going to be hot and sunny, which is what we have right in where we live right now in Southern Oregon, It just rained yesterday and today. That's okay. The plants can totally get wet. They can tolerate some moisture in those maturing colas. It's only September. It's fine. It's still pretty warm out. But if you get a lot of rain and you live in a humid area, or it's cold at night and not warming up during the day, that moisture is going to like sit in those colas and it will mold. So in those situations, if you're thinking, yeah, these are looking pretty close to harvest, I'm not sure it's mature, like as far as it could go, that's okay. Harvest it. To be honest, you're only going to have a difference in yield of like a couple ounces probably per plant for everyone at home. Doesn't matter, right? To you guys, you are going to have so much flower to enjoy and share that like having 4 ounces or 8 ounces less isn't like a big deal. They're really not putting on much weight at this point. And if it's a 12% CBD plant versus a 15% CBD plant, like, does that matter for everybody? Like, you guys tell me. It doesn't matter for me as a gardener. When I harvest my corn and my tomatoes and my grapes, I'm not out there with a Brix meter checking sugar content like, you know, a winery would on their grapes. I just taste a grape and it looks pretty ripe, and we're about to get a big rainstorm, and I think I'm going to harvest my grapes. And you don't have to be so measurement oriented with it, because a 12% flower is going to be just as tasty and fun and enjoyable and shareable as a 15% flower, I think. So you guys tell me if you feel differently, but I would much rather harvest flower at 12% and do it on a Monday and not have to stress all week about whether mold is going to get my crop and have to harvest that on a Friday and get a couple extra percent, because mold kills your crop. Once you get like all that bud rot happening in there from the mold, you can't use it. So it doesn't matter what percent it is. And it's a pain in the butt to like trim out and deal with. And then you're like, oh, I don't want to smoke this or give it to other people because I'm concerned. Like, it's much better to harvest early when you know your plants are ready and there's no mold issues. So think about that, everybody, for a little while. And if you have questions around it, just ask in the chat box. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the slides, but I'll stop for questions. I want to make sure we cover drying and preserving. So just really quick, because I know a lot of folks are growing in containers versus in the ground, and have asked me a lot of questions offline about that. Don't worry about it. Container versus in the ground, again, same plant, might just look a little different on the yields. So it's likely smaller in these ways: plant size, the thickness of the colas. So maybe instead of being a super thick 7-inch cola, like the dominant apical one, it might only be a 4-inch cola. That's okay. Just look at the plant that's in front of you and see how it's changing over time, and say, wow, it's gotten a lot thicker in the last 2 weeks. And the stigmas, you know, half are brown and it's super sticky, time to pull it. Whereas your in the ground plant might be, you know, have a 7-inch cola, and be ready. So it's a different width, but one's in the ground, one's in a container. The length of the cola might be different, and I'll show you that on my plant when we go back to the video. And the total yield, the yield of flower, you know, instead of getting a pound, you might get a half a pound if it's in a container and that kind of thing. But that doesn't really change when you harvest. It just really, all these things just change how much you get at the end. It's not when you determine harvest. So you're not harvesting any differently in a container versus in the ground. And that's the main point of this. Potency, flavor, aroma, firmness, all those cues should be the same. You don't harvest a tomato grown in a container any differently than you harvest a tomato grown in the ground, right? Same as cannabis. So harvest your cannabis just like your tomatoes, like any fruit in your garden. You have to wait and watch, check your plants, check the weather, and then harvest. The cues you're looking for are going to be size, color, aroma, and firmness. And I should add onto this slide the stickiness and the sparkle, and then the stigma color. So sorry, I need to add that back to this. And as a reminder to everyone, do not worry about CBD percent or yield. It's, if you harvest on a Monday and you're thinking, oh gosh, what if I can wait till Friday? Like, don't worry about it. The difference between a Monday and a Friday is not that big of a deal. It might be 12% CBD versus 15%, a little bit more yield. Does it matter? I don't think so to you. It doesn't matter to me, because I'm still going to enjoy that beautiful, you know, bounty from my garden, just like I would my tomatoes. I don't know what the Brix reading is on my tomatoes, and I don't need to know what the exact, percent CBD on my plants are. It's not going to change that much over a couple days, despite what you might read on the internet. Okay, so right there, I'm going to pause really quick again. So unless we have other questions, so again, you want to make sure, so in terms of checking whether it's ready, I'm going to physically review for everybody. You can see this guy. So you can see like it might be hard to see in this light, but really frosty. So getting super frosty everywhere. The aroma is intense, actually. It's amazing. This is not, this is just so floral and citrus. It's actually quite nice. Might keep it in arrangement in the house today. We'll see. And as I showed you earlier, the little hairs, just to review, the little hairs are still really white on this plant. When I look at, each of the cola, just this is called a cola, by the way, if I haven't mentioned that earlier, like a flowering bract of cannabis, we call it cola, but it's really just the flower structure, but we call it colas. They're mostly white still. So I wouldn't actually harvest this to dry yet, and that's fine because this plant, so Victory is ready in some climates right now, but you could also let it go like another 2 weeks probably. So like Noe, who I know lives in the Pacific Northwest, other people, it looks like your plants are getting ready. Let them go a bit longer if you're in the Pacific Northwest. Whereas I've seen photos from growers in Southern California, and I'm like, harvest that plant, because all their stigmas are brown. They're super sticky. The leaves are starting to die back. That's another thing that can happen, but you don't really want it to get to that point. So if you're in more northern areas, you're going to want to hold on to your plants for another week or two probably. But I'm just showing you with this live specimen here what, on its way to full maturity looks like. It's probably another week or two out. And firmness, when I literally go squish your nugs, go squish them, go out there, give it some squish. You're going to get sticky. And if they don't feel particularly dense and firm, they're not ready yet. They're going to have kind of they're going to have some give, but have like a firmness to them after you squish a little bit. And that's important. So that's it for this section. If you guys don't have any additional questions, and I'm going to now transition to talking about how actually to harvest and dry and preserve your product. So how's that sound, everybody? Pretty good? I hope so. Thank you, Judy. I love it. Thank you, Gabby, everybody. Okay, so going back. So the first thing is you have to create your drying space. Again, no different than for any other things you're going to dry. If you ever dried persimmons, rosemary, apple, well, apples are different because you use dehydrated, but like if you ever dried any whole fruits in your home or herbs, same thing, totally the same. Don't believe the internet about all the fancy stuff you're supposed to have and gadgets. It's just like drying persimmons and other things. So if you're doing it indoors, most people use a bathroom, a closet, or a garage. It's going to smell amazing. That's up to you. That's your judgment. But we all know as soon as we get close to our plants, they're very pungent. So wherever you set up your drying space is going to have a lot of smell for the like week or two that you're drying in there. So just keep that in mind. And there isn't, much you can do about it, to be completely honest. So it's just a special time of the year. It should be between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of the temperature, humidity, ideally 50 to 60% humidity. In a lot of regions of the West, the humidity is much lower, which is fine. And you can actually dry outdoors if it's not that cold and damp at night. So it really depends on where you live. So just know your environment. Having a small oscillating fan with good airflow is helpful. It moves things around in there to help them dry out faster and prevent mold. So with that being said, mold, like drying anything in your home, like if you were drying tomatoes for sun-dried tomatoes or persimmons, or rosemary, your mold is your biggest issue when you're drying. So having a clean space that is kind of dark and has good airflow is going to go a long ways. One of the main questions you can answer with cannabis is a bit different. It's more like the herbal, like if you're drying calendula at home and things. Do you want to hang the colas or do you want to use the bucked flower in containers? And that's kind of a big decision point, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. So if you choose, and also I just want to pause here and say, there is no wrong way. There is no wrong way really to do this. Just like gardening it and harvesting it isn't a wrong way. So you can hang colas. There's a picture here from Joanna's book using coat hangers on a piece of twine in a closet. You can just hang them. You can just use twine, just attach them to twine. You can see here's an outdoor photo of someone drying in their backyard. Actually, it's also from Joanna's book, so it must be her backyard in Berkeley. Just tying it to string and hanging it up outside to dry in the kind of a shaded spot. Totally fine if it's not too moist at night. You can also use garden netting, fencing, or trellis. So the photo directly below the text is just construction netting. You can get like a little thing of netting cheap at the store, or off of a different project, repurpose it, or a trellis that you're not using, tomato cages, a thing of like fencing, a panel of like that metal chicken wire fencing or paneling, and just set that up in your garage at an angle and just attach the colas to it. You'll see here in the construction netting photo, we just looped a bud, a little structure off the cola over each little rung on the construction netting. So there's no paper clips to throw out. There's no fancy anything, not a big deal. So if you have the space to hang your colas and you like that method and you have some supplies around it, like twine or coat hangers or the right space vertically, do it. Not wrong, not right. Just a good way to do it. Just like you'd hang up a bush of calendula or rosemary or whatever to dry in your garage. Same. You'll notice here the shot on the far side in the closet, the leaves are still attached to the colas, whereas in the other two shots, the leaves have been removed. So trimming leaves is up to you. You can leave the leaves on your plants, but they're just going to contribute more moisture and lengthen the time to drying. So I recommend pulling all the fan leaves, those big leaves, at harvest. It's really simple. I'll show you how in a moment. But you can see there's different styles here, and it doesn't really matter. If you're pressed for time and you just want to cut and go and put them in your garage and hang them up really fast and deal with the leaves on the back end, no problem. Not wrong. Go for it. Another option is to buck the flower and dry it that way. So it will dry faster, and it's also in its like final form then for packaging. And you can put it on trays. You can put in hang baskets for cheap vertical storage. Not a great photo here, but basically they sell these baskets that are cheap. They're out of like a washable nylon that have these tiers. And when you cut your colas, you just take the little nugs off and throw them on these little verticals, and they dry really fast, and you can dry a lot of material in a very small space. The one downside is that when you do this, your nuggets will be like flat on one side, just like if you were drying a persimmon, it would get flat on one side because it's on that tray. But like, who really cares? I mean, flat nugs do not extract or smoke any different than perfectly round nugs. Okay. So I really want to emphasize like that difference between like a dispensary product and a homegrown product. If it's easier for you to put in the effort up front and like strip down your colas into these bucked nuggets that then go on these shelves for drying at harvest, and you get like a little bit of flat flour coming out of it, it's still perfectly delicious, wonderful flour. It just might have a flat spot on it. So you could have some huge gains in terms of drying and everything already being done when you go to package. So with that, I'm going to pause really quick, see if there's any questions. Aromatherapy room. Yeah, that is so right. Andy, in terms of harvest, just let your plants, they're fine. At this point, you're so close to harvest, let them droop. It's okay. If they break, dry it and harvest it. Don't build more structure. Just let things cook, like let it go. I mean, you can try and trellis it more if you have the time, but like it's really not a big deal. They'll droop, but once the water comes off of them, they'll perk back up. They're just really heavy right now, probably because of the water you've had the last couple of days. So now I'm going to go into cutting colas. I always cover drying first because you need to think about your drying before you harvest. So get your drying strategy set up first before you decide to cut anything. So you can absolutely freeze bucked flower and make tincture later. If you're like super pressed for time, you ran out of drying space, and you're like, forget it. Like, I'm out of drying space, I'm out of time, but I don't want to waste my crop, and I'm leaving for the weekend, and a storm is coming, and mother-in-law's coming, like whatever you need, whatever's coming, and you want to stop the process right now in your garden. You can strip the plants. So you can take, you take off a nug, take off as much of the leafy chlorophyll, material. I'm using my hands here like a fool. It's faster if you have scissors like I have here. And you just, oh my gosh, I cannot tell you guys how fragrant this is right now. I wish you had smell-o-vision. It is, my whole house is going to smell like this in like 2 minutes. This is amazing. So you just kind of go around really quick and just trim off all the leafy bits. I mean, not all the leafy bits. You don't have to get nuts about it, right? There's still this here. It's wabi-sabi, right? Like, it's fine. Just get a lot of the, this stuff, off of it real quick. And then, yeah, Gabby, if you want to throw all of and then what you do, Gabby, is you take these nugs off the stem. So see how now I'm revealing the stem that they all are on? Take all these little bits off the stem as best you can. And if you get to the end where you have to just like break it, you can just break it off like a little thing here where most of the stem's gone. And then throw all of this in a freezer bag. You're totally right. Just load up a freezer bag. And then when you're ready to put them in alcohol or coconut oil or like whatever you're doing, it's fine. The issue is these plants are about 80% water. So as you know, when you do the math on your tinctures and your extracts, they're not going to extract as well in alcohol or fat if they have all that water in them. And that's why we dry our products. But you don't have to. If you have people coming over and you want to make a tea or like a little butter real quick that's herbed for them, just go grab some fresh, harvest, just go grab some nugs, throw them in the pan of butter, saute them in that. It'll infuse. It won't be like the best extraction ever, but you also didn't have to dry it, and people were coming over and you wanted to make an edible really fast for them. Totally doable. Just like you would use, dried rosemary versus fresh rosemary. They're both products you can use. They have just different culinary flavor. They come out differently in fats and alcohol. So yeah, Gabby, you can absolutely just throw all this in a freezer bag and go. The issue is when you throw it in a freezer bag, it's always going to be wet and mushy. So you're not going to ever be able to re-dry this nicely and smoke it or, make a pre-roll with it. Like, you can't. It's just not going to happen. So you're always going to have to use it as like a wet processed thing. Just like if you freeze basil, when you freeze basil, you're not going to want to it's never going to crisp back up and be nice and dry like that. But you can totally do a quick preserve that way. Just make sure you take those nugs off the stem. So at the end, you're going to have, all this debris is just left and put in your compost pile. So that's the question there. And then in terms of drying, again, I recommend just quickly, you can do it by hand in the field. When it's on the plant or at home, you can just take all these leaves off. You can just rip these fan leaves off real quick, or you can go around and you can just trim real quick. You don't have to be particular about it. Just hack away to get most of the flat of the leafy bits off your plant. And it's going to do two things. It's going to remove moisture because leaves are just moisture. And as your bud dries, the moisture from the leaves and from the stem are going to leave the high concentration areas and go to your dry outer areas here over time. And we're going to talk about that during the preservation step because it's a big deal it's where people can go wrong in harvesting and preserving cannabis, I should say. And I only have 5 minutes left here, so I'm going to go back to the presentation. So cutting colas. The plants are sticky. Sometimes you want to wear gloves. If you wear gloves, then you just take off the gloves. And these can be gardening gloves. You don't have to get like fancy black nitrile gloves. Penny recommends using olive oil and salt to clean your hands. If you get that sticky resin all over you, just soap and water does not work well. You have to use alcohol or olive oil. She just does olive oil and kosher salt to remove from her hands. Pair of pruners is good. Containers for your harvest. So just like a tote, a garden tote, like you'd use to harvest all your lettuce or tomatoes. And then 70% isopropyl alcohol instead of the olive oil and salt for like cleaning tools or your hands or tables and stuff, just because it gets sticky. We already talked about trimming on the cola afterwards. I really recommend trimming all the leaves off first, but there's no wrong way. Just means it take longer to dry. And bucking or hanging whole, that's really a personal decision about your space and your time. Both are great options. Just showing you there's many different sizes and shapes of colas, and these could all be equally ripe at different sizes, widths, and lengths. It just depends on the cultivar and whether it was grown in a container in the ground, but they could all be equally ripe. You really have to look at like the size relative on your plant, the firmness when you touch it, the aroma, the stickiness, those stigmas. Those are like the main things you have to look at, not that they look different. Okay, so when drying becomes preservation. So how you know it's dry? So now you've cut your colas and you've either hung them up or bucked them in the vertical baskets. Squeeze and smell your flower every couple days. You know, it should smell fresh and drying and maybe hay-like, and it should take between 10 and 14 days to dry. So if you start going longer than 14 days, think about changing what you're doing. You need more airflow. Your humidity is too high. They're all bunched together and they're not getting enough airflow, so they're not drying nicely. But 10 to 14 days is pretty common, and the dried material will store indefinitely. Think like a high quality tea after it's been dried. So there's a lot of talk on the internet about how you know it's dry. Honestly, it's a feel for the at-home gardener. And just like when you dry your own herbs at home or persimmons, like you just kind of know when it's dry. Use your cook gardener intuition. There isn't like a magic number for at home. We use special equipment, water activity meter to check on the farm, but that's really for commercial scale when you're putting pounds and pounds into totes. So you really just want to, they call it the popcorn test. And once it has like a little bit of a crackle and it feels sort of outer dry to you, it's done. It might take, just want to say here, it might take up to 10 to 14 days to dry. It can also be much faster. So like, for example, when we've dried in our garage, which is very low humidity here in Oregon and relatively good airflow, it can take only 3 to 9 days. So that's why I recommend every 2 days or so, check your flower. Just go say hi. Give it some squeezes to see how moist it is and how it crackles. Give it some smells. Look at it. Make sure it's not molding. Throw out anything that is molding. And you'll be fine. It's really not, it doesn't have to be an exact science, I should say, to give you fantastic product that is enjoyable and safe to share with family and friends. What else? So containers. So I've shown here a food safe bag. I highly recommend food safe bags because they come in large formats, and you can put all of your flour once you've bucked it down and it's dry in this bag, and then it basically is good to go forever. And now I want to talk about the lowdown on burping. Yeah, so I'm talking about the lowdown on burping, and I'm going to go back to video for this so you guys see me. Okay, if anyone's done any research online, as I bet you have, on curing, you know that like after these nugs get dried down, which you can see I have the bag here. Like after these nugs get dried down, ooh, oh man, that is pungent. After the nugs get dried down into, you know, these colas, and this is our culinary grade hemp that is available on our website. And this is like, we have stickers in the bags too, but this is an example of what I call culinary grade hemp. If it's still on the stem, water is going to come over time and move from the stem to the drier areas of the plant. It's going to go from high concentration to low concentration, right? So the water is going to like move to the outside. So when people talk about burping and curing, biochemically, like there are processes that happen during the curing stage. This is not like fine Cuban tobacco. Like it doesn't work like, you know, Cuban cigars where like there's this whole, or vanilla beans where like there's this crazy aging process to get all these aromas and flavors. So the whole burping thing, you're going to read a lot about it. I'm not behind it. What I am behind is checking your containers. So for the first week, especially after you package everything, every other day or two, like just open the bag, give it a smell and be like, Oh, yeah, that's great. Just be like, ooh, I can't wait to share this with everybody. It's really not a hassle. It's more like, oh, let me just go check it. If you see some moisture going on, maybe get in there with a paper towel and like wick out some of that moisture, shake the bag a little bit, and that's fine. So this is after it's dried and it's like in your pantry. And people call it burping or curing because they do it in mason jars. They say, take the lid off once every day to like redistribute gases and moisture. And I'm like, huh? Like, what's the humidity in your room? Is that really, like, the humidity in your room is really that much lower than the humidity in the jar? It shouldn't be if you dried it properly. So I just recommend looking at your stash like during the first week, every other day or so, just giving it a smell, making sure there's nothing funky going on, making sure there's no moisture that's accumulated. And if there is, just kind of mop it out. And if it seems like it's not quite dry enough, like you start feeling it and you're like, ooh, actually this was super dry when I pulled it and put it in the bag, but now it feels kind of mushy and sticky and a little too wet, take it out. Set it on a tray for a day or two in your drying area and let it dry out again, and then put it back in your bag and then seal it up. Not a big deal. Really isn't a big deal. So I think the main thing is don't worry about some sort of aficionado drying curing process. Once it's dry, bag it or jar it. Food safe or glass is always best. Tupperware and Ziplocs get really gross and the terpenes can leave, and it's not a good. I really recommend like these food safe, really like terp safe, we call them, bags for storage, or glass mason jars. And then you're good to go, and definitely like a good oolong tea. So Judy's got a question. After the drying process, if the nugs are immediately decarbed, will that help stop mold? That's a great question. So decarbing your product means raising it to a certain temperature to then change CBD to CBDA or THCA to THC. Yeah, decarbing dries out your bud. If you want to decarb your whole harvest, and that is like your way of making sure it's extra dry, like that's fine. But the decarb takes so little time at that temperature, it doesn't really dry out your cannabis. So I don't think it's really a big deal. A food dehydrator, you can use a food dehydrator for drying, Cheryl, but you're going to lose all your terpenes. So if you don't care about terpenes, and that's fine. I use a dehydrator for my research samples because I don't care about terpenes when I'm just checking CBD and THC %. So I quick dry in a food dehydrator. I absolutely do it all the time. So I know it works great. So just break down the nugs, put them in your dehydrator, put them in, take them back out. You'll be good to go. But you're going to lose all the terpenes because they're going to basically, all the volatile terpenes are going to come off at that temperature and that airflow. They're going to come right off your plant. So they might still be tasty, but they won't be as tasty, and they definitely won't be as aromatic. Plant is not a perennial, Dania. I am sorry. I wish it was. It's an annual. So it's something that's going to mature and then die, just like your tomato plants. So with that is my lecture for today. If you guys have any other questions, I'm happy to stay on the workshop and answer some more questions since we started a few minutes late. And I just really appreciate everyone being here. So I'm happy to stay online and answer questions. I just want to reemphasize how great, these books are as resources, our website as a resource, and then just, it's like any other plant in your garden. Don't be so worried about exact timing, exact harvesting, exact ripeness, exact drying, exact curing. You don't do that for your tomatoes, and you do not need to do it for your cannabis, despite all of the misinformation and anecdotal information on the internet. Great. So unless anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to stay on the call for a few more minutes. Let's see here. Ooh, Gabby's got a 10-foot plant too. So I don't think I missed any questions. Oh, thanks everybody. Yeah, unless you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'll give you guys a few minutes to think about it. see how. Writing up the book information, Beginner's Guide to Growing Great Vegetables. Okay, so I just put the 3 books in the chat window. Also, the blog will be hopefully updated very soon this week with a lot of the resources I presented today will be in like text format and linked to the books. And then the book guide will be there. And then I'll also have some hyperlinks to other resources that are quality on the internet. I'll just say it's really hard to find quality resources on the internet around growing cannabis. So much of what I read, I just disagree with from as a gardener. It doesn't make sense. And then as someone who's grown a lot of cannabis commercially and then in my backyard, in a sense, they're not practical. And it's really legacy, weird stuff from indoor illicit market growing that doesn't make sense to me as a gardener or a commercial person. So beware of the internet, but I will aggregate resources for everybody online. And that will be in our blog post coming up. And we have some partnerships with Hy-Vee Life and others coming up, Ardent Cannabis, where you'll also get that information as well. I guest contribute to them. Awesome. And Dania, thank you so much for the platform. The screen share is too small. Yep, exactly. Yeah, I think maybe we'll go back to, oh, stop sharing. How about that? Is it bigger now? So maybe if I leave screen share, does it make the video bigger for you, Dania? Yep. Sorry, everybody. If I'd have known that, I could toggle in between screen share and not. But I kind of don't like the toggling, to be honest. So I appreciate that feedback, everybody. Maybe this is the last time we'll use Wix events. We'll see. So I really appreciate it. At that, you can get in touch with me on our website. So visit growitfromhome.com. We have all of these awesome storage bags and stickers so you can customize your victory labels for friends and family available on the website. Culinary grade hemp available. And then I'm always available for questions as well. So I am excited for everyone to get started harvesting and enjoying their crop. So have a great rest of your weekend, everybody. Thanks for coming.